There's a wander down. There's a prayer on top as always. If you wish to pray with me, let's pray. O Most High, when you came down and confused the tongues at Babel, you divided us. But when you gave tongues of fire to the apostles, you called us to unity. Renew in us this fire of unity so that all may be one and praise you with one voice. Amen. Okay. So we've been talking about gender the last couple of weeks, and we've looked at what the Bible says about men and women and inequality, women in leadership. So we've kind of talked about all these things. We got into gender to just start beginning to think about those categories. Today we're kind of going to wrap this up. And we talked about language for God and those things too, right? And we're going to wrap this up a bit today really the theme here is transgenderism. So there's a couple of things I want to say about that. One, unlike all the other topics we've talked about, I don't have all that much confidence here. So the other ones, these are things I've lectured on, I've researched, I've worked on. This is so new. I don't feel like I've got it under my own sort of understanding as well as the other ones. I've been reading some books. If you're interested, this has been a good one. I've been reading Who's Afraid of Gender, right? It's a pretty difficult book in terms of both a sociology and a psychology, but also politics. But it's just this is where we're at. That's I think the other big point here is this is a huge issue right now in our politics, right? We're arguing about what's at stake here, right? And it's fairly new, right? I'm sure there have always been people, since there's been people who probably have bucked gender norms and expectations, but we're in a new kind of place in that we actually now have the technology to change a person's gender, right? That's a new thing in the world. So we can't expect the Bible to speak to that directly, right? Because obviously when it was written, that technology wasn't available, right? And really what's at stake, I think, in all of this is why it's kind of this big encompassing issue, is we're asking where our gender norms and ideas come from. Are they rooted in biology? Or are they rooted in society, which means we create them differently in different societies? Or is it some sort of a mixture? That's part of what we're getting at, is where do we all have an idea of what makes a person a male or a man, and what makes a person a female or a woman, right? Where do those ideas come from? And again, are they rooted in biology, so they're affixed? If that's the case, they'd be the same everywhere all the time? Or are they rooted in our societies, and they develop and change? It's probably some combination of both, right? There are obvious things about men and women, males and females, that are rooted in biology. I can't have babies. Not ever going to happen, right? And that's part of my biological identity. It's affixed, right? It's also the case that men's bodies produced more testosterone, so they tend to be bigger and stronger, right? So there are things rooted in our biology, right? But what about all the other expectations we have about how we should wear our hair, what kind of clothes we should wear, all these sorts of things? Where do they come from, right? And I briefly put this on the back of the handout under where I say terminology. This is just one thing to kind of introduce you to. When these sorts of things are discussed in academic literature, there's this pretty established distinction between a sex and a gender, that they're actually referring to different things. That when we talk about a sex, we're talking about biology, right? To put it very crudely, what's in your pants, right? That's what we're talking about. When we talk about a gender, we're talking about social norms and expectations, right? How should women act? How should men act? We have these ideas of what makes a person a masculine, right? Or a feminine, and sometimes we apply them. We can say this male acts rather feminine, or this female acts rather masculine, right? So again, where do those ideas come from? This is part of what's at stake, right? So I think there's all kinds of things we could talk about here, and I do think we can make this more of a discussion rather than me just talking at you. But I put two kind of themes on the front page of my handout, which I'm doing with Bible verses. The first one I could have drawn on all kinds of things. And I thought I'd just put the very first one in there, right? From Genesis chapter 1, right? Where we get God creating human beings. And God says, let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and all these things, right? And then verse 27 is the big important verse. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them, a male and female, he created them, right? So here we have God saying he creates human beings, and they come in two kinds, male and a female. So the traditional, and now we could call it the conservative position is, God made people that come in two kinds. If you're outside of those two kinds, we have a problem. If you don't identify with how you were born, we have a problem, right? But this is the way that it is, right? I will point out that if you read this verse in the original Hebrew, it's weird. It basically says this. So God created the Adam in his image. In the image of God, he created him, referring to the Adam, a male and female, he created them. So the pronouns and a subject changes between arguably a name, the Adam, though that's also just the name for human beings, right? But it's a singular. In the image of God, he created him, referring to this one thing, right? The human species. And then a male and female, he created them, right? So it's already interesting there. So, but this, yep, go ahead.
Because of this discussion, you're sweating?
Yeah, I'm hot here. The temperature's hot. It's not that I'm nervous, just so you know. But I'm warm. If I didn't have just a t-shirt on, I would take this off.
According to the English teacher, elementary school, I got points off.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's some weird things happening, right? But I just want to, this is in a certain sense, this is the core of the traditional or conservative argument is God made human beings in two kinds, male and a female. Obviously, this is tied up with reproduction, right? We need to make more people. How does that happen? We need a male and a female. That's how it works.
So who wrote this?
Who wrote what? The biblical passage?
That you're taking as truth.
Well, our Christian argument is human beings under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit at some point, and who did it? It's always a bit of guesswork, but it's probably Jewish scribes writing sometime after the period of exile. So they're in exile, right? Putting together their own history because now they need to write it down, right? But we're going to come back to this passage. There's a different way to look at it. I'm just highlighting, this is all over the Bible. God created us male and a female. It actually shows up again if you look under the heading that says eunuchs, where it says Matthew 19, you go to verse 4, and here we have Jesus actually quoting the passage we just read from Genesis. Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and a female? So Jesus got the same words, right? And he's using it to talk about a marriage, right? Which we'll come back to. But this is the other thing I want to point out is the Bible then also pays attention to the fact that there are people who are, the category they tend to use is eunuchs. And I've given us a selection of passages. And my argument is here, there's a movement in the Bible. So the very first time we really get this mention, I heard a couple of you talking about this passage because it's not one that gets read often in worship, right? But Deuteronomy chapter 23 verse 1 says, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall come into the assembly of the Lord. So if you're a male and you've had some kind of damage there somehow, right, you don't get to go into the temple. And the argument is that because your body is now corrupted, you're not holy and you can't enter into the presence of the temple, right? So there would be other things here, right? People in an active state of sin also wouldn't be allowed. So this is about ritual purity and these kinds of things. A woman who's menstruating isn't supposed to come into the temple either, right? So this is kind of that same thing, right? So we get exclusion, at least from, you're not kicked out of the nation or out of the people, but you are, because of this defect, are not supposed to enter into the temple, right? By the time we get to Isaiah, we're getting a different attitude here, right? So, thus says the Lord, maintain justice, do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance be revealed. Happy is the mortal or the human being who does this, the one who holds a fast, who keeps the Sabbath. So basically, those who keep God's law, right? Don't let a foreigner join to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people, and do not let the eunuchs say, I am just a dry tree. So people who have been excluded are now being included, non-Jewish people and the eunuchs.
My question on all this is, how did they check?
Right.
They all
Well, I mean, I think part of this would be, and I think this is the thing that it's hard for us to identify with. One, the population would be much smaller. So Jerusalem at this time would be smaller than Grand Haven. And that would be a big city, right? 10 to 20,000 people would be huge. So one thing, you're more likely to know who everybody is and what their business is. That's part of it, right? Yeah.
I love the way the Matthew thing ends. Let anyone accept this.
Who can? Yeah, right. You're right. I mean, that's right. But I think this is part of how they would. You would know. So you would know if your neighbor's child was born with some kind of defect, because you would talk about it. Yeah. Right. And again, you're not being born in the privacy of a hospital. Right, you're being born in your house. Everyone's aware. Everyone's helping everybody. That's how you would have to survive. So you just know, right? If some kind of accident happened to you, people are going to know. So I think that's part of they don't have to check because they know. Now, if you're a stranger who comes to town, I don't think they're going to lift up your robes and look, but right. It would also be the case of, if this happened to you as a youth, as a male, you'd be able to tell, right? Because your body wouldn't develop, right?
In the case of the eunuch, that was encountered on the road, and that was done to him to protect.
Probably, right? Yeah.
Him from the
Right. So again, we actually, and we're going to come to that. So if we go to the Isaiah passage, right? We've got these people being included who were excluded, and it goes so far to say, "For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters." So here, eunuchs are not only being included, they're actually being said, you can do just as well as everybody else and maybe better, right? So there's this movement from being excluded to being included, right? If we go to the New Testament now, Matthew 19, here we get a passage about a marriage. So Pharisees come and ask Jesus, is a divorce lawful for any cause? And Jesus actually does what he often does. He's actually more strict than the Old Testament, right? He quotes this passage from Genesis, says the two shall become one, they shouldn't be separated, right? And actually says Moses was too lenient, right? But he did this because of your hard hearts, right? And then the disciples say this is a hard teaching, it'd be better to never marry, right? And Jesus answers, says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only to those whom it is given, right? There's this mystery here, but then he says, for there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? So the history of this passage, this is actually used to argue for why we would have monks and nuns, and why clergy should be a celibate, that you can choose to be a eunuch in terms of we're not actually doing anything to you, but you're choosing not to exercise your sexuality, right? There's people who are made that way. That's probably the case of the eunuch in Acts, of he's a servant to the royal family as a way to make sure he doesn't mess around with the queen or the princesses. They make it impossible, right? Pretty common actually in some ancient cultures, right?
Wasn't it also true that in the early church there were eunuchs for the church choir to sing?
Well, so we do, not in the early church, but we definitely get this in the Middle Ages of, right, for a church music and to get those beautiful high voices, right, there were actually boys who were castrized, right, and then this is what they did for the rest of their life, right. And so, again, what would happen, their bodies would never develop, their voices would never drop, right?
That's what they thought about weed.
I don't know, but yeah, I mean, this does kind of happen, right? But again, but Jesus is actually aware of this. He's realized there are people who are born with issues with their genitalia. There are people who are made eunuchs, and there are people who choose to do this, right? So he's kind of telling us, hey, things are more complicated, right? And let anyone accept this who can, right? And again, this is tied up with the conversation about marriage. So Jesus is opening the door to not everybody has to be married. This doesn't have to be the norm for everyone. There are other ways of living your life, and they're perfectly okay, right? I think it's part of what he's saying. And again, that means acceptance, right? I mean, the norm in Jesus' time was everybody would get married. It's actually quite odd that Jesus isn't married. If he realizes what's going to happen to him, that might explain it, right? But it would be odd for a Jewish man of his age not to get married. And then if we look at Acts, so this is a story we probably know, we get Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right? So Philip gets transported by an angel. He goes down the road from Jerusalem to Gaza, so we're very much in sort of present day events as well. And there was this Ethiopian eunuch. He's a God-fearer is the category we put him in. So he's a Gentile, he's Ethiopian, but he's basically a Jew in terms of his religion. So he's gone to Jerusalem to go worship, and he's going home. And he's reading the Bible, he's reading Isaiah. And he doesn't understand it, and so God brings Philip to him, right? And he begins to explain it to him. And what happens at the end of this is Philip baptizes him. So here, very, very early in the history of the church, we're again getting a person included who doesn't fit these norms. So my argument here is just if we look at the actual, the little bit of evidence we can get out of the Bible about people who are different, who don't fit the binary, we go from exclusion to inclusion. There's a movement, right? So that's just the Bible verses I want to put before us. Now, if you turn it over, I want to I'll mess with these a bit, right? So my first kind of category here is technical issues. So I've got a question, what is, and I'm going to use a very technical term, a merism. So it's a figure of speech, right? In which, and it's a pretty technical thing, but we need to highlight it, in which totality or completion is expressed by contrasting parts or polar opposites, right? So here's a really easy one. If I say I searched high and low, what do I mean? I searched everywhere. It doesn't mean I just looked high and just looked low, right? It means I looked high and everywhere in between, right? That's what this kind of figure of speech is, right? If I say from A to Z, I don't just mean A and Z. You know that I mean everything in between, right? We get this all over the Bible, right? So I gave us a couple examples. So God created the heavens and the earth, right? Does this mean that those are the only two categories things are in? Or is it actually an expression that means everything? It means that obviously, right? When God says he called the light day and the darkness a night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Again, does that mean there was only evening and morning, or does it also mean there was afternoon? You get the point I'm trying to make, right? So this is how language works, right? Again, I got this one from the Psalms. When I sit down and when I rise up, right? Again, what is this about? It's God is watching over everything that I do. He's not only doing it when I sit and when I stand up, right? This is pretty common sense. So my question is, what if God created the male and female operates this way too? Right? It's actually, it doesn't have to be either or. There's a spectrum here, and those are the ends of the spectrum.
Okay.
Interesting thoughts.
Right? It's just one. I mean, again, it doesn't have to be this. It's just a proposal.
We often talk about, that person is on the spectrum.
Right. I mean,
That can mean anything.
and I think it's even worth pointing out. Like, this is why I kind of hinted at this earlier. We do talk about there are women who are more masculine and men who are more feminine. Right? Even our categories of what it means to be masculine and feminine are obviously on a spectrum. We could talk about very masculine men or very feminine women, right? And everything in between. Now again, that's talking about our social expectations, and I think this is also worth pointing out. Of if you went to a different culture, especially if we could travel in time, we would find that people have different expectations of what it means to be a male and a female, right? These things aren't necessarily affixed. Yes, some things are obviously affixed, right? Who can have babies and who can't, right? But it's actually a pretty small list of the things that are affixed, right? So anyway, if we think about this, right, if there is a spectrum, this is one way to think about it, right, then we need to we keep reading in Genesis, we get to the end of the first creation story. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So are those in-between people, are they very good, right? Because this is the issue, and this is the question I put here in part 2 of we can't argue with the fact that some people actually aren't born male or a female. There's a very small percentage of people, and actually the stats are it's 1.7% of the population is born in a way that they don't fit fully into our categories of male or a female, right? Extra X's, right? So I mean, we get the whole category of hermaphrodite, where we actually do get people who are born with testes and ovaries, right? So there are people born that way, right? You get people who kind of are more male, but they also have some female biology. And you get the vice versa, people who are more a female but also have some male biology. So it does happen, right? As I was kind of doing some reading about all of this, I found this really interesting article. I put it in the footnotes, my footnote 3 there. And it's a Jewish woman talking about these themes, and she highlights that both it's the Mishnah, which is kind of a Jewish New Testament. It's written in the second century AD, and it would really be the sort of teachings that would have been around when Jesus was alive. She highlights that in the Mishnah, it actually argues for there being 5 genders. Second century, and that actually matches a whole bunch of contemporary science, which also says there's actually 5, right? With male and female, and then in between there's people who are really just both, true hermaphrodites, and then you get people who are mostly male but not wholly, people who are mostly female but not wholly, right? Wholly there's WHOLLY, right? Right. So, I mean, this is just this. So she was making this big deal out of the fact that this old Jewish text actually matches contemporary science fairly well, right?
Everything is always black and white.
Right. And I highlight this because, right, if one way to think about even the contemporary debate that we're having is, and I hate to put labels on all this, but the more conservative side is arguing people who don't feel like their bodies match the gender they have in their head, right? Something's wrong with them, right? Or we have to, and what do we say about someone who is born a hermaphrodite? Is this a problem? Is this some kind of a corruption that we want to fix? Because often we do, right? Or is it a good thing? It just doesn't fit the standard binary, right? So if we say it's a good thing, then we have to affirm that it's good, and we shouldn't try to fix it. The alternative is to say that this is actually all a consequence of a sin, right? I mean, basically we're saying is being born a hermaphrodite being like having cancer. Is it a disease? Or is it good, and God actually wants people to be born this way? That's what we're asking, right? I think this is a hard question to answer, right? Because we do kind of want everybody to fit into these two categories. Life will be easier for you. This is why when kids are born in ways that don't perfectly fit the binary, we usually fix it. So we have done historically, right? We cut things off, right? And so that they will fit one of the gender categories, right? And then one of the questions we should ask is this good, or is it bad and we should fix it? If we say it's good, if we say someone who's born biologically, right, with in a way that doesn't fit the binary, then I think we need to open the door and ask the question, what about people who, again, they don't feel like they identify with the gender they have in their body, a sex they have in their body, right? So their gender and their sex are at odds, right?
So as a Christian, I would like to think that if the person isn't comfortable with who they are, we should be helpers to help them feel comfortable and accommodated.
Well, and again, this is what we're asking of, like, I don't have an answer for you, but this is the debate. So if you've got, a 16-year-old who is biologically a male, but would be more comfortable if they could wear girls' clothes and even change their body to be a female, what do we do? Do we send them to therapy and say, hey, we need to get you figured out here? Or do we send them to a surgeon?
And isn't there research that shows that therapy doesn't go?
Well, yeah, I mean, the research is all over the place, right?
Or send them to the therapy first and then...
Right. I mean, I think I want to point that out, right? I mean, this is, if we frame the current debate that's happening, the conservative side says, well, God made you that way. If you try to change it, you're basically telling God he made a mistake. And the counter to that is, well, we have all kinds of other things that are wrong with our bodies. We fix those all the time.
And God gave us the mind that allows us
so that's,
to do that.
But that's the one side, right? The other side, I guess the more progressive side says, well, if this is how someone feels and we can change them, let's do it, right? There, I think we should pause and say, why would we want to do this quickly? Is a 16-year-old or even younger able to sort of make these decisions when it can't be reversed, right? And there is a difference between cancer, which is going to kill me, and changing my body on a thing that doesn't actually put my life in danger, though it may put my mental health in danger. I mean, my point is, it's complicated, right? There's not an easy response here, but I think it's, there's some things here that the gut reaction of God made you this way, are you telling God he made a mistake? That doesn't really work to me, that argument. Nor do I think we should rush to the other one of, just because we can make these changes, we should. Right? Yep.
But then there's a whole other question of gays and lesbians in the church.
Yep.
No surgery is involved.
Right.
And it's taken the Presbyterian Church a long time to recognize that. And many Presbyterian churches are called more like congregations. And are accepting of ordination and marriage and everything else. So it's not always just concerned with surgery.
So I mean, and again, that's the other issue here of how is this. I mean, but again, you can see how these issues are tied. And so one of the interesting things that you will see is we've got all kinds of people who are very accepting of people who are gay or lesbian, because again, we don't need to change anything. But we get to the transgender issue, and it's a completely different conversation, right?
It's a whole other area.
And this actually goes both ways. So amongst, again, I'm using labels, amongst progressives, you'll get plenty of people who say, yes, I'm all for people who are gay or lesbian, but we're not going to do a surgery. They're opposed to the transgenderism stuff. There are all kinds of evangelicals and conservatives who will say homosexuality is a sin, but are actually open to transgenderism and doing surgeries. So actually, the dividing lines don't always fall where you would expect.
Well, there's the same variation among each sect.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, right. So this article by a Jewish woman I was talking about, she's actually asking questions about how Jewish people should proceed on these. So she says, if we're okay with it, so if we're going to have people do surgeries, right? What if it's an older couple, but I mean, at least people who have been married for a period of time, and one of them wants to transition? Do you get a divorce? Are you now a homosexual couple? Like, how do we handle that, right?
It's interesting. Lived next door who were male and female, and they had children together. Now they're at the age of 40, 50.
Yep.
And he determined he was female.
Yep.
Surgery.
Yep.
And it was really tough for her. But she still loved that person, now they were.
Yep, right.
But it put her own sexuality kind of in.
Yep.
That's question.
No, this is exactly right. Right.
I think there's something else.
And it happens. I just want to say, along with what Ben mentioned, I think it was in the 80s, the National Organization of Presbyterian Women were far ahead of this than the General Assembly.
Yeah.
We had women on the floor who were daughters of Presbyterian leadership and also capable, very bright, well educated. It's just not, in my opinion, it's not for me to be cutting any of these people out, any way, shape, or form. I don't know why who it would bother, except maybe people in some circle or something. And when we talk about both the evangelical and conservative group, are we not talking about people who may in their own areas have issues with, or have children of their own or family members who might fall in that, and
well, and I think this gets us to the heart of these issues and why they're so political in terms of if we begin accepting all of these things, right, it's going to change the dynamics and the fabric of the way that our societies are organized, right? I mean, we're pretty organized along binaries of male and female, right? It's either or. And think of where we use that language. I mean, we use it all kinds of other, I mean, you go to the hardware store and there's, right, male ends and female ends for all kinds of things, right? That's how we use this. Our brains are all, they've been programmed to think in those binary categories. Right. Well, and again, this is the other thing, right? And again, what's tied up with all of this is our sexual norms, right? I mean, there's this huge issue of we don't want boys going into the girls' locker room or the bathroom because what are they going to get up to? Right?
Unless you're a eunuch.
Right. Well, right. Well, and again, this is what makes this. I don't even know what the adjective is. Right. It's interesting, problematic of. Right. There's this element of we got to protect women from men who are using this to prey on them, right? So what are we doing instantly? We're saying this is the real reason behind this, right? Well, that assumes that the people who want to make some of these changes or don't feel comfortable with who they are, that really there's some kind of alternative motive.
And that is a terrible problem.
Yeah. And it gets into things like, I mean, we're talking about like sports seems to be this other big argument of we've done so much, we have made so much progress to get women's sports off the ground. They're becoming increasingly equal with men's sports. But what do you do if you have someone who was born a male and their body has developed enough, right, that they're bigger and stronger and faster because of testosterone, and then they want to make this change? Is it fair, right? So you can these issues get complicated pretty quickly.
They want to compete with the women.
Right. And I do think it's worth pointing out, like, I mean, I totally get the argument. Like, I'm actually somewhat sympathetic with it. But if you look at the concrete on the ground details, one, it's an incredibly small percentage. Like, I think in the state of Michigan in 2023, there were 7 cases of trans kids who were born a male wanting to compete as a female. So it's pretty small, right? And they usually don't win. At the end of the day, right? They don't actually like take home a championship. So the concrete data kind of contradicts the common sense. Like, it feels wrong to us. Of course, it's not fair, right?
Most of us women were raised when we couldn't even compete.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, and I think, and again, this is the concern of if we instantly sort of turn to this other new issue, does it actually undermine all of these things, right? So and I think this is one of the big pushbacks against the whole transgenderism thing, is it potentially actually disempowers women again, which is one of the forces you get pushed. I mean, you get very progressive voices who are actually pushing back because they're trying to stand up for women, and they see this undermining that. Yep, Kent.
I've umpired baseball, softball, for 50 years. Yeah. And when I'm behind the plate, it used to be the umpire would put their hand on the catcher's shoulder to determine which way they were going to move and so on. Male or female, it didn't make any difference. But now the rules say, keep your hands off. Which, that's a social norm that has been introduced.
It makes us, you can't make the right call.
Right. Well, and again, I mean, why has our social norm changed? Because we're more aware of the cases of abuse that are there, right? And so the consequence is we got to have hands off all the time, right? I mean, that's like this is an analogy that will make a sense. We just had a congregational meeting, right? We have a book of order. A whole bunch of you in here are elders. When we teach that book in a seminary, one of the first things we say is there's blood on every page. And the reason is almost everything in the book of order is there because somebody did something stupid. So now we have to have a rule about it, right? So this is where a whole bunch of our social norms come from, because like Kent isn't going to assault anybody, but one person did, so now we can't do that anymore, right?
Or somebody felt uncomfortable.
Or somebody felt uncomfortable about it, right?
But I think that young people today are much more accepting.
Absolutely they are, yeah.
And it's really quite annoying to think that there are people that think, well, you chose to be a lesbian, and so that was a wrong choice.
Yep.
As if they said, oh yeah, I'm going to choose to be an outcast wherever I go.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is the interesting thing that I've seen. I mean, having someone who's got now kids in school-age kids, they are more accepting about it, right? It also does seem to cause confusion. Like they're like, think about. I mean, I'm younger than most of you, but like we all have had different choices in our lives, like the options available to us, right? You were just saying, I mean, many of you grew up without the ability to play sports if you were a woman, right? My generation did. So more and more things have become open, right? But when you can choose your gender or a sexual identity, right? If that's how it works, right? Because maybe it doesn't work right that way. I definitely think that's the case with homosexuality. You're not choosing this, right? But here we are actually saying, I can choose to have my body modified, right? That's a big choice, right? Especially since so far, if you transition from one sex to the other, you can't change it back, right? At least change it back so that everything works.
Today.
Right. Today, I mean, and we might get to the point where we can. Right. What does that mean? You can change it a couple times. Right. I mean, it's. Right. Exactly. But I mean, this is the. But I mean, part of this point is to think of, we can see why people are freaked out. I mean, again, if you're interested, this book I've been reading, Who's Afraid of Gender, I mean, it's really what the author is doing is she actually goes through and says, look at all these different contexts, the politics behind it, of if we can do this, everything's going to fall apart. It's a threat to our whole order of life. And she rightly points out that's exaggerating, right? Because most people are going to fit into the binary. Right? But what do we do with the minority that's getting bigger, right? Where this is now open to them.
Is it really getting bigger, or we just more?
Right. I mean, but that's the idea. We're now more aware of it, and it's a possibility, right? And so, I mean, again, it used to be like, let's say you were born with some sort of defect, right? It got hidden pretty quick. Right? A surgery would happen when you were an infant if they could. If they couldn't, they didn't ever tell anybody, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we're not doing that anymore. We're now openly saying we can address this, we can change. It's becoming more accepted, right? It is going to disrupt norms. That's what makes people uncomfortable. A change is scary.
In cases where women, because they weren't allowed to do something like be a soldier.
Yep.
I know there was a woman who wanted to be a musician. They hid their identity and were men.
Yep.
In fact, there's one they didn't discover that this person was a woman until she died.
Yep.
What's the name of that book?
Who's Afraid of Gender? The author is Judith Butler, right? And she wrote a book like 20, 30 years ago called Gender Trouble, which is a classic of how to think about a gender. Anyway, so I don't have any answers here. I just wanted to like say, hey, here's what we can do, and there are other ways to think about this. Yeah.
I just went from last week. We were talking about him.
Yeah.
Just some of you will know from the Muskegon Civic Theater, they now underneath each person's picture says she, her, he, him.
Yeah. So I'm on a Zoom all the time. I just have to be, right? And I think about my age is the dividing line of anybody younger than me on their Zoom. It says their name, and then in parentheses it says their pronouns. All of them, right?
Thank you.
And there's pressure to bring to like have that on there to say like I support this, right?
I support it.
And I'm kind of like, do what you want.
Which is why you said for your children in school. I mean, those are decisions now that they're having to make. They're moving into in a sense.
And we haven't had to make those, right? And again, I think this is where there's this tension of, think of how confused we all are from about ages 14 to 20, right? And it's not to say that these aren't like young adults who aren't smart, who can't make the decisions, but you are figuring out who you are.
And there's biological things that are going on.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
Absolute definitive changes biologically at that age.
Yep.
Well, and our language has changed as well, because we're including words that describe all those different areas. It was interesting, Ryan Rock had to go to, he's going to high school. He had to put what ethnicity he was. They didn't have a category.
Yeah. Well, and again, and I think this is a big picture thing of why are we obsessed with categories? Right. I mean, I would thought it was puzzled. Like you go to the DMV, and then Marge, you've been trying to raise your hand, but let me say this last comment. You go to the DMV, and why do I have to check a box for male or female or my race? What does that have to do with driving?
Or whether I'm married or divorced.
Right. Exactly. Right. Anyway, Marge, you were gonna say something.
Yeah, well, it's the pronoun thing. And there are places that they are like disciplining teachers that are using the wrong pronoun. We were raised, and I even taught kids, you know, that this is a correct pronoun to use with that. And, you know, your lesson last week, it kind of opened up. Oh, okay, well, this isn't recent. It's going back in history, you know, kind of. But for people to be put on probation with their job because they use the wrong pronoun when they're using what they grew up using.
Right, and I think that's the issue of like, I mean, we're all going to default. So this is the question I have about all this pronoun stuff in a classroom. Which is why I think it's all kind of a fake, right? I don't talk about people in the room in the third person. Like, I'm going to use your name, or I'm going to say you. I'm not going, why would I talk about Doug to Joan when Doug's sitting right there? Like, did you hear what he did? Right? I mean, it's like, we don't, it's weird, right? And so, I mean, I think we're creating an issue to fight about, right? But I think, so that's the first part. The other issue is if, yes, I mean, we're going to assume I see you, I've got all these social norms. You clearly present as a woman, Doug presents as a male, right? So we tend to fall into that, right? But what do we do as increasingly it's harder to tell because of the way that our social norms are changing, one, right? Two, in that sort of community setting, like, yeah, if people need to go, we can go. But I mean, in a community setting like a classroom or here at a church, right, where we know people, if I tell you I want you to use they, them, why wouldn't you? Because it isn't actually you using the pronouns wrong. I'm asking you, can you refer to me this way, right? That's just a sign of respect. And this is where it gets complicated. Like somebody doesn't want this, or somehow if you can make me call you he when you're really a she, you're violating my religious freedom, and that's just nonsense.
The Mrs. and Miss kind of thing.
Right. I also think it can. Yeah, I think it does tie up with that. It can also go the other way of, like, everybody's got to tell us what their pronouns are. And what if you don't want to? Right. What if I don't care about? I mean, it's just like I'm happy to say, like, if that's what you want to do, but I don't want to do this for me, right? And I think this is the issue of we're forcing people, whether you're on the left or the right, right? But anyway. Well, I'm not solving anything. We're just seeing how complicated it is. Right.